Hey everyone, this video gives some background on Dungeons & Dragons and what makes 4th edition different. If you don't want this overview and would rather get right into making a character, you might want to skip this one and head on to the next video. Before we get into the details of the game, let's talk about what 4th edition is and maybe touch on why it has the reputation that it has. Obviously, 4th edition is the 4th iteration of the Dungeons & Dragons game, but that's not entirely true. You see, just like with movies, the original Dungeons & Dragons didn't have a number. It was just D&D. Then there was Basic Expert D&D by John Eric Holmes. Then there was Advanced D&D. Then there was BECMI D&D. 2nd edition D&D came out in 1989 and was actually labeled as 2nd edition. Therefore, everything that came before it is grouped under the retroactive 1st edition label, even though each of those games was at least slightly different from the others. So officially, 4th edition is the 4th iteration. But if we're really counting original D&D, Advanced D&D, Basic Expert D&D, BECMI D&D, 2nd edition D&D, 3rd edition D&D, 3.5 D&D, then it was really the 8th variant of the game. But let's get into some of the key differences from those prior versions. First, a few things that they all have in common. They are all fantasy role-playing games that involve players creating characters with different abilities with roles to play during the adventures. The different abilities in play have been the same all along: strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. Each character consists of a race and a class. They each have weapons and armor and gear. They have hit points. They move at certain speeds. They have different types of vision. Some can cast spells. Others are about fighting, while others are better at social encounters and exploration. All characters earn experience points when they complete encounters, they gain levels to earn more abilities, and treasure found can be spent on new equipment. As for playing the game, it has always consisted of a dungeon master guiding the party on an adventure. The players decide where they want their characters to go and what they want the characters to do. The DM interprets the rules and uses dice rolls to determine what happens each step of the way. All of these things have been the same since that first Men in Magic book was published in 1974, and all of these things exist in 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons. How each of these things is implemented has changed a lot over the years. In the early days, there were only 3 classes: fighting men, magic users, and clerics. The only races were men, elves, dwarves, and halflings. Only certain races were allowed to play certain classes. Over the years, the number of races and classes has grown substantially, and the flexibility has also greatly increased. For example, the initial 4th edition player's handbook has 8 different races plus 8 different classes. 3rd edition represented a major shift in the game as the rules were overhauled to what is called the D20 system. This version introduced things that are common today, such as ability modifiers and skills and damage types and conditions and feats and spell slots. The important thing to understand is that even by 3rd edition, the mechanics of playing Dungeons & Dragons had changed significantly from those early versions, but the underlying principles of fantasy adventurers exploring the world and fighting fantastical creatures has remained the same. So what was so different about 4th edition? As I mentioned earlier, 3rd edition introduced many new concepts into the game. Most of these things were very well received, though there might have been some complaints. 4th edition, released only 8 years later, was also a large shift in how the game was played. Some things, such as skills and ability modifiers and feats, remained, but spell slots went away and combat rules were updated to lean into the idea of having a physical map of the table with tokens to represent players and monsters. This was not a new concept, but 4th edition really took it to the next level, and it's one of those ideas that people look back on and see 4th edition as being ahead of its time. 4th edition introduced the mechanic of using powers to represent all the things that a character could do. Fighters had martial powers, clerics had prayers, wizards had spells, but they were all considered powers. In 3rd edition, a player might make an attack with their sword. They would roll a d20 and add a bonus to it. If they hit, then they would roll a die to determine the amount of damage. In 4th edition, the character would do the same thing. They could attack with a weapon and add a bonus, and then they would deal a weapon die damage on a hit. But 4th edition also had all those powers. A player could use a power that allowed them to make their weapon attack, but if they hit, it would allow them to do something additional, like shift their position or deal extra damage or heal or any number of other things. The powers really made combat interesting because there was a ton of stuff that the players could do. Some of the class features from 3rd edition, like sneak attack and rage, were reworked into class powers in 4th edition. Others, like animal empathy, were altered by emphasizing skill bonuses that accomplished the same task. 4th edition was as different from 3rd edition as 3rd edition was from 2nd edition. But this doesn't change the fact that the game is still Dungeons & Dragons at its core, and it's a lot of fun to play. So that's a high-level look at what 4th edition is. Let's turn our attention to actually creating a character and playing the game.